Welcome to our 24th annual Spring Banquet in the fall and virtually. Wow, what a year. But we are here and we appreciate so much having everyone join us tonight for our annual celebration of history. Fasten your seatbelts and get ready for about 90 minutes of history fun. Let me remind you that there are a few advantages to having a virtual banquet. For instance, if your grandkids need your attention or your dog needs to go outside, you can pause us and then come back to us when you're ready to give us your undivided attention. So if you picked up your boxed meal from us earlier today, or you have your own meal, settle down and get ready for a fun evening. Okay. Before we begin, we need to bow our heads and give thanks for this exciting opportunity to celebrate our history and to break bread together, virtually. Giving tonight's invocation is my friend and our community leader, the Reverend Dr. Edward Scott, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Mary Baldwin University and pastor at Allen Chapel AME, one of the most historic churches in the state of Virginia. I can't think of a better person to open our evening of history. Dr. Scott?
Holy God, blessed are your vaulting skies, holy are your frost-capped mountains, and blessed be your verdant valleys. Holy are your rivers, your lakes, and your billowing seas. Blessed are your winged creatures that glide and soar. Holy are the sure-footed, cliff-dwelling mountain goats, and blessed are your creatures grazing on your waving leaves of grass. Holy are the swift-swimming dolphins, and blessed are your deep-diving leviathans. Holy are your vines, your earth-rooting trees, and your shrubs and bushes too. Blessed have you made men and women to also be, if we but choose the splendor of will and liberty to hear the call you have made for us, to obey your charge to conserve and protect, to steward and preserve, to cherish and to care. Bless us now to be strengthened in the gifts of your good earth. Hallow the bread we break and sanctify the wine we imbibe. Then grant our spirits to fly. Let us dance with nimble minds and make us fearless to plumb fathomless time. Then might we sing in joyful tune with larks and nightingales. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Amen.
History marches on. Despite a worldwide pandemic, the business of preserving the past for the future must go on. After all, one day this will be our history too, and 100 years from now, someone will be standing in front of a crowd, just like tonight, talking about the pandemic of 2020. Just like we presented a program on the flu pandemic of 1918 as part of our 2018 commemoration of events during World War I. There is no doubt that we have made some adjustments this year. For instance, we immediately converted our Driving Tour brochure to a downloadable PDF so that people could enjoy a ride in the country while practicing social distancing and learning some history at the same time. Although we were shut down to the public for many months, our staff, particularly Archivist Donna Huffer, has been working hard getting our amazing archives into good order and processing it, making it available to the public. We are beginning the process of digitizing our tens of thousands of documents and photographs, so in the future, if there's a pandemic, our collections will be accessible to the public whether or not we're shut down. We have continued to add new items to our archives and library, and our other work continues as well. For instance, we are further along than ever on our wonderful bulletin, our historic journal of important history and events in the greater Augusta County region's history. So our members who get this wonderful history-packed journal as part of their perks of membership can look forward to a more exciting history-packed journal than ever before. Throughout this evening, we are going to provide a few snapshots of the many projects that we have been working on in the past and look forward to working on in the future. Stay tuned and get ready for an enjoyable evening. All right, one of the most exciting projects that we've been working on in the past year and we'll be working on for the foreseeable future is a partnership with two Eagle Scouts, Hunter Klein and Elijah Trumbo, on a very historic community out near Buffalo Gap called Jonesboro.
My name is Hunter Klein.
And I'm Elijah Trumbo.
I'm standing here at one of the Jonesboro home sites. This community was founded in 1878 and thrived up until the 1950s, mid-1950s. This community was mostly African American, and most of the community members are buried in the Jonesboro Cemetery. The community of Jonesboro is spread over an area of 63 acres, and I'm standing here at the Lewis Hill home site, which is Hill residence.
I'm here at Jonesboro Cemetery. There are known to be 36 people buried in here. And before we went in here, there was all kinds of brush and fallen trees. And so I took my troop and my friends in here and we cleaned it up. And so one of the things we put in was a sign. My dad made this post and routed the sign, and then we painted it. And so we'll just take you on a walk down here. Another thing me and my dad built was this gateway. We took just some posts, put them in the ground, and took some boards and put them on top, and some caps. But it's a nice thing to polish it off. So now I'll come over here. This is something that two of my friends built when we first started on this project. It's just a little bench that they made out of some logs and sticks. Now I'll come over here. This is the first row of graves. Only one of them has a marker, and we don't know whose it is, as you can see. Keep coming down here. You can see there's more indentations, and we're getting closer to some actual gravestones. This is one of the more prominent indentations. And this marker says is Nathan Henderson. And this marker actually has 3 people on it. This is Payne. Frank Payne, Susan Payne, and Gertrude Payne. This is Cleta Smith. This is another one of the actual gravestones that's in here. This is the last person that was buried in this site. As you can see, this rock looks to have an H written on it. We believe that it might be a footstone of the Hendersons because the Henderson marker is over there. This is one of the last things we put in. My dad got a bench from his work and put it in here. It's a really nice bench. We just thought we'd put it in here for people to come in and sit. And anybody watching this, you guys are welcome to come in here and just look at stuff. And so the last thing I'm going to show you guys is this big plot that has a few markers on it. Right over here. Come around to the front. And this person's name was Mary J. Gaines. This cemetery was used for the community of Jonesboro and the citizens of Jonesboro. Everybody buried in here is either a descendant of a citizen or an actual citizen of Jonesboro.
One of the most important things that we do on this annual evening when we gather together is to give some very important awards. And one award that we have given for many, many years now is our History Educator of the Year Award. And here tonight to tell us who the winners are for 2020 will be Linda Petsky, our teacher extraordinaire and board member and past president.
I like to call this year's recipients of the Educators Award the first family of Fort Defiance. As residents of the community for many years, these two will help you at a moment's notice. Case in point, do you need to set up a Historical Society annual meeting at Augusta Stone Church? Well, call them. It'll get done. Do you need to set up a special field trip for some students to go to maybe Augusta Military Academy? Call them. It's going to get done. Do you need information about the Daughters of the American Revolution, Stewart Hall, or Augusta Military Academy? Well, make sure you call them. In case you have not guessed it, this year's Educators of the Year are Mal and Linda Lavick. What a blessing these two have been. After returning home from serving his country in Korea, Mal started teaching and coaching at Augusta Military Academy in Fort Defiance. Wouldn't you know, that year the school had a Thanksgiving dance and Linda was home from college. Linda's family had started at AMA way back in 1865. Now, when these two met, a dynamic partnership was begun. Mal went on to become assistant commandant of the cadets, eventually superintendent of Augusta Military Academy, and Linda was always at his side. This duo made all the students there feel at home with their constant care and their all-encompassing activities. Just look at an old AMA yearbook. When you look through the ages, you will find Linda being a hostess or their daughter Lee in a play. All this while raising a family of their own. Now, even after AMA closed, our duo was not done serving in the community. Mal went on to Blue Ridge Community College, where he served as a director of continuing education. Linda went to Stewart Hall to serve as the alumni director. Their service to education continues. So it is with great pride, gratitude, and love that I present this year's Educators of the Year to Mal and Linda Lavick.
Conversations from the Grave. That's when several of the residents of historic Thorn Rose Cemetery come to life for a few hours and meet some of our visitors from the Historical Society. It's been a program that we've been excited to produce and bring to you for a number of years now, and conversations are back in September of next year. The genius behind Conversations from the Grave has always been Lucinda Cook, who decided to do the program, came up with the idea, and researches the scripts and the personalities to bring this to life. And it's been a huge hit with our visitors and a huge important fundraising effort for the society. So I'm going to let Lucinda tell you a little bit more about what we can expect from Conversations from the Grave coming up next September.
Hello, my name is Lucinda Cook, and right now I'm standing in Stanton's historic Thorn Rose Cemetery. And I've just happened to have run across a few of the residents who live here year-round, and they're asking whether the Augusta County Historical Society plans to return its popular program, Conversations from the Grave. Well, yes indeed they are, and the dates are September 18th and 19th, 2021. This is a program for those that are not familiar with it, where guided tours take groups through the cemetery, and along the way, they stop and meet some of the most interesting, unique, and yes, scandalous individuals who now make this place their eternal home. There will be more information forthcoming in 2021, so mark the dates, September 18th and 19th. You will not want to miss this spirited event.
My name is Bessie Weller, and I'm delighted to be with you today. A native of Stanton, I attended Mary Baldwin Seminary before being admitted to Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. In 1917, I was hired as the city's first school nurse, a position I would hold until retirement in 1945. One of my greatest achievements was the creation of the 5-point system. This was a method to evaluate children's health and recommend treatment if needed. Children received a point in 5 areas: weight, hearing, vision, teeth, and throat. If a problem was detected, such as infected tonsils, and then corrected, the child received a point. The goal was to be a 5-point student. Short theatrical presentations were given in primary grades focusing on practicing good hygiene, and awards were given to the classes with the most 5-point students. I am very proud that recognition of my 28 years as school nurse came to fruition in 1952 when Bessie Weller Elementary School opened, the first to honor the achievements of a faculty administrator.
Allow me to introduce myself. I am Dr. Samuel Haidt, and I have a cure for what ails you. Do you suffer from chronic pain? Well, I am famous for my pain-relieving liniment, effective on man and beast alike. Do you have a sluggish system, or do you have frequent colds, croup, and embarrassing internal disorders? Do you have sores, scaly skin, and boils? Well, you can forget about all of those. I have developed compounds that treat virtually any affliction and stop disease dead in its tracks. I started my career in 1871 in a small laboratory in Moffat's Creek, but my curatives did so well that in 1877 I moved to Stanton, Virginia, with an expanded operation on South Lewis Street. In 1905, since my patent medicines were doing so well, I made plans to move to Roanoke, Virginia. I passed away in 1917, but some of my patent medicines survived until the 1960s. Before you go, I just happen to have a bottle of my famous pain-relieving elixir here. Good for what ails you.
For many years, the Society has gone into banquet night full of confidence because we knew that our audio and video man, Gary Kirby, had things under control. We even planned to honor him this year with a plaque thanking him for his service. The pandemic has given him the year off, but we would like to thank him anyway. Gary, we couldn't do without you. See you next year. When he learned of the award that he was getting, Gary's response was, "It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be involved with the Augusta County Historical Society for over a decade. Besides providing audio-visual support for the annual event, I have personally benefited from the fellowship of the group and from learning more about the fascinating history of the county. Hopefully, I continue in some way for future events. Thank you, Gary."
It is a great honor to introduce our 2020 speaker, Dr. George C. Rabel. Dr. Rabel is a distinguished teacher and deeply respected scholar, specializing in the American Civil War. He is Professor Emeritus and formerly of the Charles G. Summersell Chair in Southern History at the University of Alabama. He was born in Lima, Ohio in 1950 and received his BA from Bluffton College in 1972, his MA in History from Louisiana State University in 1973, and his PhD from LSU in 1978, where he studied under the famed Professor T. Harry Williams. I first met Dr. Rabel at Anderson University when I taught there in the 1980s. Dr. Rabel taught there from 1979 to 1998, before moving on to the University of Alabama. Dr. Rabel has written extensively on the Civil War. His many books include God's Almost Chosen Peoples, A Religious History of the American Civil War, which won the 2011 Jefferson Davis Award and was a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Fredericksburg, which won numerous awards, including the Lincoln Prize, the Jefferson Davis Award, and the Society for Military Distinguished History Award in American Military History. Other award-winning titles include The Confederate Republic, A Revolution Against Politics, or Civil Wars, Women and the Crisis of Southern Nationalism, But There Was No Peace, The Role of Violence in the Politics of Reconstruction, and his most recent book, Damn Yankees, Demonization and Defiance in the Confederate South. Dr. Rabel is currently working on a book on the relationship between President Lincoln and General McClellan. And now, for a more personal view, I introduce our fellow board member, Ray Wright.
Thank you, Dr. Metro. Again, my name is Ray Wright, and it is my honor and pleasure to assist in the introduction of our speaker, Dr. George Rabel. I was one of Dr. Rabel's earliest history students at Anderson College. Among the students of what is now Anderson University, those fortunate enough to take Dr. Rabel's survey courses as a requirement for their liberal arts education left his classes with an appreciation of American history and a greater appreciation of his witty, provocative, and often interactive lectures. Among history majors such as myself, Dr. Rabel instilled in us a professional rigor that I, as a museum professional and public historian, still practice today. First of all, he taught us, be a critical thinker. Thanks to Dr. Rabel, I encourage my students and the young historical interpreters that I mentor to critique and validate the information that they use in their profession. Outline the chapters that you read. To this day, when reading text, I underline and highlight as if I had to turn in outlines of chapters of required reading to Dr. Rabel the next morning. Write clearly and succinctly. I have smugly scribbled in the margins of undergraduate writing syntax in a hand every bit as legible as Dr. Rabel's. I learned that the hard way. Finally, while preparing for this introduction, I ran across a, mimeographed exam for American History 348, History of the South, taught by Dr. Rabel, and dated March 3rd, 1982. Question number 2 stated, the institution of slavery in the antebellum South stifled Southern economic growth, created wide class differences among white people, perverted religion, and ruined Southern intellectual life. I forget how I responded to that statement in 1982, but I hope, thanks to the good fortune of studying under Dr. Rabel during my academically formative years, that I can answer this question to his satisfaction in 2020. Thank you, Dr. Rabel, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. I first want to thank Nancy Sorrells for the invitation to speak. Very honored to receive it. Thanks to Richard Adams for help with the technology, which I greatly needed. And of course, much appreciation to my friend and former colleague Daniel Metro and my former student Ray Wright for their overly generous introduction. As you might imagine, the question of God in general, was there a religious history of the American Civil War, is a title meant to some degree be provocative. Did God serve as a kind of general that controlled the course of the Civil War, as many Americans believed? Is there a religious history of the American Civil War? That is the question posed in the title for this talk. And I guess since there's going to be a talk, the answer to that question better be yes. I think there is a religious history of the American Civil War. And I believe there are probably multiple religious histories of the American Civil War. As Abraham Lincoln himself stated in his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, both sides prayed to the same God and read the same Bible. And he might have added that they read that Bible in remarkably similar ways. Just to give you a sense of the religious landscape on the eve of the Civil War, in 1855, out of a population of 27 million Americans, it was estimated that some 4 million were members of some Protestant church. Now, that may seem like a low number to many today. We see the 19th century as pervasively religious, and it certainly was in many respects. But we also need to realize that the standards of church membership over the years have changed considerably. Church membership was a much more demanding thing in the 19th century. You had to be willing to have your private life scrutinized carefully by fellow church members. You often had to make a public profession of faith, particularly in the Baptist churches, to become a full member. So that 4 million out of 27 million, lower than we expect, but still it shows considerable evangelical growth in the first half of the 19th century. Along with that growth was a powerful sense of divine providence. It seemed like the ordinary events of life were often interpreted in providential terms. There was a strong belief that the story of America was part of a larger story of human history, a kind of unfolding of providential design, if you will. Now, we mere mortals could at times catch a glimpse of this larger meaning, but human history, both in its long sweep and in its messy details, remained in God's hands. Such God talk was commonplace. It was simply part of the language of everyday life. So it's hardly surprising that many Americans would use their religious beliefs, and especially ideas about providence, to interpret both the sectional crisis of the 1850s and the Civil War itself. Though today a lot of this experience, I think, is forgotten. Some of you may recall in the aftermath of 9/11, three prominent American ministers, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and President Obama's former minister, Jeremiah Wright, all claimed that 9/11 reflected the judgment of God on American sins. Now, these three men differed on the sins for which they believed America was being judged, but nevertheless, they interpreted 9/11 in a distinctly providential framework as a reflection of divine judgment. Journalists at the time were sort of amazed by this. They could not understand that way of thinking because they didn't realize that this kind of thinking, this providential interpretation of events, had been absolutely commonplace throughout much of American history. And it was certainly commonplace in the Civil War era. For their part, Civil War historians have generally failed to incorporate religion into the larger narrative of the war. Yet in many ways, you could argue that the American Civil War was the holiest war in American history. It was a providential war. The sectional tensions of the 1850s, the secession crisis in the winter of '61, were seen as providential, punishment for individual sin, punishment for collective sin. Virtually all religious groups embraced a providential interpretation of current events. Less than a month after the firing of Fort Sumter, a leading Quaker weekly observed that national sins, unless repented of, are always punished by national calamities. War was seen as a kind of divine judgment on the entire nation. If that's true, then Americans needed to discern God's purpose in the conflict. But what was that purpose? And that becomes one of the central questions of the war, and certainly a central question in looking at a religious history of the war. Was this war punishment for sin, as many Americans believed? If it was punishment for a wide range of sins, broad definitions of sins, collective sins, individual sins, slavery, political corruption, partisanship, gross materialism were just some of the sins mentioned. But also Sabbath breaking, profanity, drunkenness, and gambling might also be included. These broad definitions of sin crossed ideological and sectional lines. It was not necessarily, in other words, a conservative emphasis on individual sin or a reformist emphasis on collective sin. To just cite one example, many Americans agreed that both intemperance and slavery were besetting sins of the American Republic. Many of the temperance reformers were abolitionists and vice versa. Many preachers and lay people, North and South, compiled similar lists of transgressions. In that sense, the two sections were remarkably the same. But there were some distinctive Confederate themes. For example, the Confederates described the U.S. Constitution as godless because it had not mentioned God at all, compared to a Confederate Constitution that invoked the favor of Almighty God. There was even a wartime movement in the North to add some acknowledgement of God or even of Jesus Christ to the U.S. Constitution. Some Confederates argued that their nation was being punished for political preaching, that the United States was being punished for political preaching, for bringing politics into the pulpit, not an issue simply confined to our own time. Virtually all Southern clergy, in one way or another, defended slavery, though some acknowledged that slaveholders had fallen short of biblical standards in dealing with their slaves. And of course, Northern clergy emphasized the sinfulness of rebellion with suitable biblical citations. Religious voices, whether Union or Confederate, seldom expressed much doubt that God was on their side. And although pious young men and their families sometimes ask whether a child of God could be a soldier, most churches and clergy answered with a decided yes. The opening prayer of a New York Methodist conference, and being a Methodist, I'm going to be fair and pick on the Methodists in this talk to some degree. The opening prayer of a New York Methodist conference came right to the point. We ask thee to bring these men, the rebels, to destruction and wipe them from the face of the country. Writing to his brother, a Southern Methodist minister matched this blood-curdling rhetoric. It is a righteous war, he said. I feel a deep Christian and inextinguishable hatred toward the demons of the North who would desolate our country and destroy its liberties. It is doing God's service to kill the diabolical wretches on the battlefield. Sectional loyalties often predominated, therefore, in the church's reaction to the war. A Southern Methodist deemed the Confederate States of America the last hope of freedom, the last home of the pure gospel. Northern civil religion was equally fervent. We will take our glorious flag, declared Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson, and nail it just below the cross. And having studied Bishop Simpson, I would suggest he might have nailed that flag slightly above the cross. Now, Quakers, Mennonites, and other peace churches often maintained their witness against war, but they did so circumspectly, very cautiously. Quakers, for instance, sought exemption from conscription, and they received a sympathetic hearing from the Lincoln administration, a less sympathetic hearing from the Confederate administration of Jefferson Davis. Quaker editors, wisely I think, refused to advise tax resistance, and several acknowledged that many young people in their own meetings, in their own congregations, had become caught up in the war excitement. And a number of young Quaker men had actually enlisted in the Army. And this becomes a real issue for some of the Quaker meetings late in the war and after the war. What are you going to do with these young men who have violated the peace witness of the church, have served in the Army, and now have come home? Should they be expelled from the meeting or not? Obviously, during the Civil War, many Americans, regardless of their particular religious faith, used that faith and used their view of the Bible, their interpretation of religious history, to explain the course of the war itself. Notions of providence, the idea of war as punishment for sin, apocalyptic warnings of divine judgment, all became powerful and flexible ideas with which to interpret wartime events. Religion, of course, provided comfort to the anxious and to the grieving, as it always does, but it also offered an explanation for the war itself, for the suffering and anguish, for victory and defeat. Battles and their results became signs of divine intent. The first major battle, Bull Run, or what the Confederates called First Manassas, will serve as a prime example. Here, a bungled Federal flank attack and fierce Confederate counterattack just north of Manassas Junction, Virginia, drove the Yankees skedaddling back toward Washington. That's First Bull Run or Manassas in one sentence. That's pretty good for a Civil War historian who might tend to get bogged down in military detail. We don't need the military detail here. We need the religious meaning of First Bull Run or First Manassas. For the victorious Confederates, the outcome of the battle itself became a sure sign of divine favor. And this manner of explanation became absolutely commonplace throughout the war. But what about all the brave and pious men who had fallen in battle? Here there was an assumption at the beginning of the war that the Lord would safeguard the righteous in battle. But that assumption was immediately called into question because obviously many of the pious young men had fallen in battle. Indeed, throughout the war, printed sermons eulogized Christian soldiers who faced death fearlessly and looked forward to reunion with their loved ones in heaven. Heaven was often seen as a homey place where you'd be reunited with your loved ones, with members of your family, which I guess is a good thing, depending on how well, of course, you get along with your family members. Letters sent home by chaplains and other officers, along with countless articles in the religious press, reported the last words of soldiers declaring their faith during their final moments on earth. Nor did the deaths of these fine young men, whether from wounds or more often from disease, seem to shake people's faith in God's sovereignty. As the Reverend Edward Reed told his rural South Carolina congregation shortly before the Confederate victory at Manassas, not one of these brave young men has fallen or suffered without God's permission. This was hardly a surprising sentiment in an era during which people believed that every death, every illness, and sometimes every minor event somehow conformed to God's will. Some folks believed that the Lord had chosen the field of combat, had supplied courage to the soldiers, and had even controlled the timing of troop movements and tactical maneuvers. By the same token, God had confounded the mighty Yankee army, just as he had scattered the Assyrians, the Midianites, or the Philistines in Old Testament times. And in a reference that surely resonated with everyone from Sunday school children to graybeards, an Alabama minister explained at length how the Southern David had slain the Northern Goliath. The first great battle of the war had seemingly vindicated the Confederate cause, and even sent some commentators leafing through their Bibles in search for references to the Southern nation in prophecy. There was a very long book published really with, I think it had the exact title, The Southern Nation in Prophecy. If you're ever suffering from insomnia, I would recommend that ponderous tome. I think it would work better than sleeping pills in many ways. In any case, within this framework of divine providence and prophecy, the smallest incidents became signs of divine favor. People praying fervently back home for the men in a company who emerged from the battle largely unscathed. God's will. The first accounts of Bibles stopping bullets, and there are always accounts of Bibles stopping bullets. In fact, often they tell you the exact verse at which the point of the projectile stopped. Though one somewhat impious Confederate wrote home to his mother how it was not a Bible that had stopped the bullet, but rather a deck of cards. I think he was the sort of fellow that liked to twit his pious mother a bit. In any event, in the aftermath of First Manassas, First Bull Run, it seemed that all the Southern people had to do was to give God the glory and keep their trust in him. Pious Northerners, not surprisingly, took a much different tack after First Bull Run. The judgments of God are upon us, declared one Presbyterian editor. The nation's leading Methodist newspaper, the Christian Advocate and Journal, published in New York, agreed that defeat had been doubtless ordered by Providence as part of a severe but wholesome discipline, which in the end will cure some desperate evils that have existed among us. God had long shaped the nation's history and would continue to do so. And that kind of reasoning would prevail throughout the war in both the North and the South. As was typical after almost every major battlefield loss, the defeated side attempted to figure out which sins had stirred up God's wrath. But the fact that First Bull Run had been fought on Sunday also struck some commentators as highly significant. The failure to observe the Sabbath in camp, along with the foolhardiness of launching an attack on Sunday, had surely displeased the Lord. Others blamed the defeat on swearing or alcohol consumption. Yet Horace Bushnell, a very prominent congregational minister and theologian, in a remarkable sermon with the provocative title, Reverses Needed, in other words, our side needs defeats, Bushnell worried that the defeat at Bull Run was a warning to a nation that had created a government, as he put it, without moral or religious ideas. In fact, Bushnell termed the Declaration of Independence itself, Thomas Jefferson's famous declaration, as nothing but godless theorizing. In his view, no wonder the American Union must face reverses and losses, such as the battle at Bull Run, because, again, in Bushnell's words, without shedding of blood, there is no such grace prepared. Now, Bushnell himself had no doubt that the North was fighting for just principles with God on its side. But he also believed that many more sacrifices would be needed to atone for all the nation's transgressions. And it's perhaps not surprising in the aftermath of the war that Bushnell himself, given his call for atonement with blood, wrote a very long treatise on the theological doctrine of atonement. In the aftermath of First Bull Run, African American clergy took yet a different tack, warning that the nation had not yet faced up to the sin of slavery. Some debated, in fact, whether Lincoln's call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, and I should note at this point throughout the war, both presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, frequently summoned their people to days of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in the aftermath of defeats, or days of thanksgiving in the aftermath of victory. In any event, after First Bull Run, Lincoln calls for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, and some African American clergy debate whether that day should even be observed. Henry McNeil Turner, who would later serve as one of the first Black Army chaplains, described the dead at Bull Run as the bloody victims of slavery's hellish caprice. Many abolitionists of both races now argued that God would allow the bloodshed to continue until African slavery was banished from the nation. Throughout the war, denominations and churches and individuals, North and South, agonized and argued over the role of slavery in the conflict. Religious folks of various stripes had long debated whether God opposed, sustained, or was indifferent to slavery, and the war reshaped the discussion in both the North and the South. In the North, by the fall of 1862, even the more conservative denominations were coming to see the death of slavery as a military, if not a moral necessity. The Northern side would not win so long as the nation clung to what one minister termed the Jonah of slavery. Even pacifist Quakers argued that God was using the war to punish the nation for its sins, including the sin of slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation led ministers of both races to invoke the Exodus story, or even talk of the imminent return of Christ. The biggest exception here were the Roman Catholics, who did not divide before the war, they did not divide during the war, and who insisted that abolition, and this includes Northern Catholics, was a dangerous radical ideology, and that the principles that had kept the Catholic Church together could have prevented the war. Catholic editors, in fact, argued that the war represented the logical culmination of schismatic Protestant principles. In other words, if there hadn't been Protestantism, these Catholic editors and theologians are arguing, there would not have been a civil war. Unity would have been maintained, just as Catholics had maintained the unity of their church. So they blamed the war on the Protestants. In the Confederacy, the churches remained largely united behind both the Confederate nation and behind slavery. Loyal Confederates refused to see the war as a punishment for the sin of slavery, but as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, defending slavery grew more complicated, I think, in many ways. Church associations and ministers readily conceded that even though slavery was sanctioned by the scriptures, the behavior of many slaveholders had fallen short of biblical standards. Reformers called for legal recognition of slave marriages and laws prohibiting the breakup of families through sale. The implicit promise was that the adoption of such reforms would therefore win God's favor on the battlefield. Significantly, these proposed reforms got nowhere They didn't even come to a vote in any of the state legislatures, and they didn't even come close in the Confederate Congress. So the slave reform movement that did exist a bit in the Confederacy among the clergy really amounted to very little in the end. The continuance of the war itself, and especially the mounting casualties and suffering on the home front, seemingly challenged a providential view of the war's course. Yet, of course, even if you accept the framework of divine providence, you realize that human beings at best could achieve only an imperfect understanding of God's will. And biblical history itself proved that the Lord had often used heathen nations to punish his stiff-necked chosen people. So even in 1864, with a butcher's bill that was almost beyond comprehension, Federals and Confederates alike had hardly abandoned their civil religion. In other words, had hardly abandoned the idea that God had a hand in the war and that his hand was on their side. The devout in both sections continued to believe that God was with them, however inscrutable his purposes might often appear. Of course, the horrific bloodletting at places such as Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg might readily lead war-weary civilians and soldiers to speak of pointless sacrifices. And you can find the idea of pointless sacrifices often in soldier letters, especially in the aftermath of a very costly defeat. Yet it also seemed logical enough for the clergy to assert that the war had spun out of human control. At the same time, each victory rekindled hope of divine favor, and defeats could still be explained in terms of divine chastisement, the kind of spiritual discipline for those whom God loved. That was the argument, and that remained the framework. God is disciplining us for our sins because he loves us, therefore the war must continue. In the fall of 1862, the Georgia Methodist Bishop George F. Pierce sounded almost like Abraham Lincoln and could not chase away a deep sense of foreboding. He preached, "We are in the Lord's hands, and I know not what he means to do with us." This sort of anticipates Lincoln's second inaugural. In many respects, the prospects before us are dark. We have wrought wonders, but seem to have gained nothing. The war is without a parallel in the past as to its origins, its battles, its progress, and its results so far. I hope for the best, but I am looking to God alone. Vain is the help of man. And many a sermon which preached on that theme, that is, vain is the help of man. Now, you could logically ask at this point, and I'm sure some of you are, to what extent did soldiers interpret the war's course in terms of providential history? Well, many soldiers were absolutely indifferent to religion, or their religious faith would build to a crescendo right before a battle and then decline afterwards. And perhaps only a minority of the soldiers on either side were deeply religious, though many of these deeply religious soldiers were also among the most determined as well as the most devout. Did they interpret the war and its course in terms of providential history? They did. They did. In fact, despite widespread reports of indifference to religion in the army of both sides early in the war, complaints that there was no Sabbath in the army, the prevalence of drinking, gambling, swearing, and other vices, criticisms of chaplains. Soldiers had often a rather mixed view of chaplains. They loved chaplains that would stand by them in the face of battle, and they deplored chaplains who seemed lazy and didn't want to do their job. It's interesting, both governments didn't seem to value chaplains very much at all, in fact, reduced the chaplains' salaries during the war. But by 1862, we also read the first reports of religious revivals in the armies, especially among the Confederates. The hope was that these camp revivals would not only win converts, but they would win divine favor. in the battle against the enemy. Revivals became a cause for renewed hope, especially in the Confederacy. Converted soldiers were supposedly more effective soldiers, but ministers and many men themselves readily avowed that individual salvation was their first priority. If you read the sermons preached in the army camps, and we have a number of these have survived, many of them are just standard evangelical sermons. They make no reference to the war itself. The emphasis is on faith and religious conversion. At the same time, the soldiers themselves could sometimes sound like the ministers in discussing the hand of God in battle and divine protection. But they also emphasized the importance of religion as a source of comfort. Soldiers and civilians alike again talked of heavenly reunion in which families would be reunited. And it's probably not surprising that people during the American Civil War pictured heaven as a homey place that would bring the extended families back together. A reunion, by the way, that would take place regardless of which side won the war. In fact, as the war dragged on, the prayers of these soldiers, and many of the clergy for that matter, increasingly focused on spiritual rather than national deliverance, on individual salvation rather than saving their respective nations. Both soldiers and civilians could readily believe that peace could come only in the Lord's good time. After all, that was part of the providential framework. The timing was up to God. Perhaps the nation had not yet been punished enough for its sins. Certainly many believed that. And of course, ministers on both sides warned against the sins of murmuring against civil authorities, military commanders, and against God. I don't know how much murmuring there was against God, but there was certainly more than enough murmuring on both sides against civil authorities and military commanders. Denouncing politicians and generals certainly was commonplace. There are, of course, sectional differences. Perhaps for Confederates, defeat with God was not so bad after all, or at least that was the argument that was made toward the end of the war. For Federals, as the war neared its end, it seemed that the Lord had finally smiled on their cause. The day after the news of Richmond's capture arrived in Washington, D.C., the Capitol itself was brightly illuminated. There was a gaslighted transparency emblazoned with the scriptural message, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." But in 1865, the forces of the modern world and its relentlessly secular tendencies were already putting great strains on this providential view of the world. But that brings us to what I think is the war's ultimate meditation on divine purpose, Lincoln's second inaugural address. I'm sure that many of you would argue that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is one of the greatest speeches made ever by an American president and Lincoln's greatest speech. I don't think the Gettysburg Address is Lincoln's greatest speech. I believe the second inaugural is far superior in many ways. It's an address that bears reading and rereading, and I've done it many times, and I always seem to find some new meaning in it. It is a profound meditation on the war and its course. It's perhaps not surprising. Throughout Lincoln's political career, he had refused to render harsh judgments against Southerners. And in the second inaugural, he is not rendering harsh judgments against Southerners. Throughout the war, he had refused to automatically equate the Union cause with God's larger purposes. And in the second inaugural, he still refuses to do that. And even as Confederate armies were collapsing in the spring of 1865, Lincoln refused to yield to the temptation of triumphalism. In his magnificent second inaugural, Lincoln somehow rose above many, though hardly all, of the pious cliches so popular in both the North and the South. He noted how both sides had not expected the war to last so long or be so bloody. He said each looked for an easier triumph. They surely did. No one expected 700,000 people to end up dead. The prayers of both sides could not be answered, he said. That of neither has been answered fully. Those are certainly hard words for people to hear. And then he makes his key point. The Almighty has his own purposes. That's hard preaching in many ways. We would prefer that the Almighty have our purposes. But Lincoln is saying, no, the Almighty has his own purposes. In fact, it is remarkable that at this seeming moment of Union triumph, Lincoln talks very little about the military course of the war. He says very little about recent victories. He does not praise himself or his administration for their successes, quite remarkable in a politician, but instead he meditates on this larger meaning of the war. The Almighty has his own purposes. He goes on to say, if slavery was such an offense to God that the war had to continue, that both the North and the South had to endure this terrible conflict, then he could only conclude in the words of Psalm 19, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now that's a very hard affirmation to make in the spring of 1865, because by that time, at least according to the most recent estimates that have inflated those numbers, over 700,000 lives had been lost. Could the friends and the families of the dead simply say, thy will be done? The Union victory and the Confederate defeat left many hard questions about divine providence and the role of God in human history. It left those questions unanswered, as Lincoln himself readily acknowledged. And of course, the whole idea of unanswered questions would deal a body blow to providential interpretations of history. And never again would an American war be interpreted in such openly religious terms. Lincoln himself believed that the second inaugural was as good as anything he had ever done. He realized that it was not immediately popular at the time. In fact, if you look at newspaper responses to the second inaugural, I think a lot of the editors were simply scratching their head. This was not what they expected to hear. They expected a more triumphal message, a more celebratory look at the Union side of the conflict. And Lincoln had cut against the grain of his own time, as he often had done throughout his life. And so they're befuddled by the second inaugural, don't know what to make about it. Not many people praised it all that highly at the time, but over the years, of course, many Americans have come to appreciate the second inaugural. In 1861, Lincoln had described the Americans as an almost chosen people. And despite expressing a powerful sense of divine providence, both privately and publicly, Lincoln never claimed any special providential blessing for the Union cause. Less than 2 months after offering his profound meditation on the war's meaning in the second inaugural, Lincoln himself would fall victim to an assassin's bullet. Was Lincoln's assassination a providential event? Many at the time thought so. Was Lincoln like Moses, not permitted to enter the promised land of victory and peace? Was the new president, Andrew Johnson, going to play the role of Joshua? Many ministers and ordinary people searched for the appropriate biblical analogies, and they meditated on the meaning of the wars and the death of Abraham Lincoln. The providential framework had shown remarkable endurance. Its persistence is striking in many ways. For the Confederates, they too had to meditate on the divine will and whether God had intended their cause to be defeated all along. So was there a religious history of the American Civil War? Yes, I think for many Americans there was. And without understanding that religious history, a full understanding of the conflict, of the greater conflict, will always elude us. Thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed making this presentation. It's frustrating, of course, to do this on Zoom because we can't have questions. I suspect some of you would have some very good questions that would set me back on my heels a bit. But in any event, I thank all involved, and I thank you all for listening.
Well, you've already heard who the History Educator of the Year is this year. Now for our other big award, and that is our History Service Award. It goes to the person or persons who have gone above and beyond the call of duty in helping tell the story of history, helping the society preserve the past for the future. And the two gentlemen who we're going to give this award to tonight are just amazing people and have helped the society year after year in putting together our exhibits, in preserving the photographs and the paintings that have come to us as part of our collection. And it is really a great honor to introduce you to Jason Miles and Dennis Morgan of Morgan Miles Picture Framers out on West Beverly. If you need any work done as far as framing or matting or preserving your items from the past, your family heirlooms, these two are the ones to go to.
Yes, I basically started framing myself about 34 years ago, my partner about 44 years ago, and then we started our own framing business for ourselves about 15 years ago. Before that, we were the framers for P. Buckley Moss over in Waynesboro and did her framing for about 18 and a half years. We love framing, we love preserving the pieces, we love getting them to present the way they should. And protect them for years to come. We do conservation framing, which adheres to museum standards, and those standards are set by the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian. Those are our guidelines. We love working with the Augusta County Historical Society. They've awarded this award this year for working with them. Their whole concept of preserving, protecting, researching the past, and especially in this valley, it's amazing what is here and what, unfortunately, what has been lost. And I hope, that it can be protected. We do a lot of preserving of World War II memorabilia, the generation that unfortunately we are losing rapidly. And actually, I believe this is what part of this award goes to. We framed up a project for the Historical Society, and Dennis's dad was a engineer and turret gunner in World War II on B-17s. He had 33 or 37 missions. Absolutely amazing. I can't imagine our generation going through anything like that.
I'm standing here in our History Gallery exhibit with the latest exhibit that the Historical Society has put on. And this exhibit is Painters and Printers, Waynesboro artists Charles Smith and George Speck. And this is an amazing exhibit, and almost everything in here that you see was matted and framed and cleaned up by Dennis and Jason, and they did an amazing job. This is an amazing exhibit. I would invite you to come and visit this exhibit.
The heart and soul of the Augusta County Historical Society is found on the third floor of the R.R. Smith Center for History and Art under the care of Society archivist Donna Hover. Donna oversees our vast collection of archival materials, paper items, the letters and journals and historic photographs, our objects, anything from pottery to belt buckles, and our library books, journals, and research files. When items are donated to the Society, she carefully catalogs and records information and then places the items in special acid-free materials so they will be protected and preserved. Donna has spent the past year organizing and cataloging everything in our new and upgraded computer system. She has also been clearing and reorganizing all of our archival space so we can fulfill our mission of preserving the past for the future. The work that Donna and her volunteer archives committee carries out is vital to our society, but the computer software and scanning equipment, as well as the acid-free boxes and folders used to protect the items in our collections, are not inexpensive. If you'd like to volunteer to be on Donna's archives committee or can support their work by making a donation, we would be very grateful. Thanks to Donna and her crew.
What an amazing evening we have had. I want to thank you for joining us, for tuning in. We've had a great talk by Dr. Rabel. We've learned a lot about our upcoming events and our partnerships. And so I'd like you to continue on this journey with us. If you're not a member of the Society, I think you'd love joining us. We'd love to have you. That gives you insight into some of our upcoming events. That gives you our bulletin, which is chock full of history. And there's lots of exciting things to know, to see and do, and you're supporting our history. You're preserving our past for our future, supporting our wonderful history and heritage. So I'd like to thank you, invite you to join us again, become a member. If you would like to volunteer, we have lots of volunteer opportunities for you. Old Buildings Committee, archaeology, archives, help us with our office work. There are lots of things you can do to help us preserve the past for the future. Thanks again. Thank you for tuning in. Yours in History.
Thank you folks for coming out and seeing us tonight. We've got the big show ready, so Paul, turn up the light.
We'll tell you about our valley and all its mystery, and what the folks have done here throughout our history.
The spirit of Augusta, oh please show us your light. The spirit of Augusta, won't you please come out tonight? The spirit of Augusta, the spirit of Augusta, the spirit, the spirit, the spirit, the spirit, the spirit, the spirit of Augusta.
In the hills of old Virginia, underneath the Blue Ridge sky, there's a place they call Augusta. It's the home of many ties.
My name is Bessie Weller, and I'm delighted. Oh, wait. I'm dead. I don't need this. But you do. You need to wear a mask.
Take me back to old Augusta, to a land that I call mine. From the time of the first buffalo to its history and folklore, it once stretched from the tall Blue Ridge to the Mississippi shore. I can hear the soft winds calling through the passing years of time. Take me back to old Augusta, to a land that I call mine. From the time of the first buffalo to its history and folklore, it once stretched from the tall Blue Ridge to the Mississippi shore. I can hear the soft winds calling through the passing years of time. Take me back to old Augusta, to a land that I call mine. Take me back to old Augusta, to a land that I call mine.